What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Story 1. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s, and she always told me that it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window, killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep, and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad, and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers, and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty messed up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now, and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck, never thinking something like that would get him killed. Kind of a similar story here. I was always told my bio-grandpa died in the war, never asked more about it. My brother was saying how he'd love to beat the crap out of our grandpa if he had the chance. I was totally confused. Why would he want to beat up the grandpa we never even met who died in the war? Well, turns out the real story is he was a horrible, abusive drunk, used to beat our grandma and mom, aunts, and uncles. He'd routinely get so plastered that my grandma had to load her young kids into the car to pick him up from the bar at 2 a.m. He was also a womanizer. Apparently, he'd been knocking boots with a couple different gals around their small town. When word got out, the guys followed him out of the local honky-tonk and beat him to death with a lead pipe, so the story goes. Then they threw his body in his pickup truck, drove it to a nearby hotel, and dumped him in a random room. No charges were ever brought. Everyone involved stayed quiet, enough that the law never got involved. Obviously, someone blabbed, as we know the story now, but it was essentially chalked up to small-town private justice. Then that same night, I learned my sweet Betty White-style grandma had an affair with a lieutenant general when she was in the Air Force afterwards. Definitely a lot to take in while half in the bag in a hotel room at 2 a.m. Story 2. Why the Neighbors Moved. Trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town, and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them. Their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day, they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused, as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill. The cops came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered what had happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home, they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and assaulted and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home, they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep, the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick, and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them, as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. Quick thinking by those parents made a workable lie up on the spot. That babysitter is a hero, too. Yeah, I'm super glad the kids were safe, but I can't stop thinking about that poor, terrified 14-year-old child. Saving those kids before she died horribly. That was someone else's child. Karen Slattery was her name, according to OP's article. Story 3. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. Kidnapped and then they didn't want him back? What the hell? Excuse me for asking, but was the kidnapping legit, or was it set up to get rid of him? This is so sad. My aunt was a real piece of work. To backtrack a moment, this side of my family isn't biological. Technically, my dad is my stepdad, but he raised me from toddlerhood, and he's my dad pure and simple. All of his family treated me as one of their own, except my aunt. She would always tell my grandparents that she just couldn't understand how they could love me because I wasn't a blood family. I have no idea why she didn't want her son back. It was a familial kidnapping, non-custodial father. When my cousin returned, she ditched him with my grandparents and got back together with her other half. When I was a teenager, my grandma called my dad, crying. My aunt was doing some digging and discovered she and my dad were adopted. I'm not defending this, but it was the 1950s and in another country. Not disclosing an adoption wasn't unusual at the time. My aunt threatened to tell my dad, so my grandma called and said they were adopted. My dad's reaction was literally, "So?" My aunt never spoke to my grandparents again, and my cousin turned out exactly like her. And so all those years of not liking me because I'm not blood backfired, because she isn't blood either. I'm glad that has never mattered to me. Oh man, sorry for laughing, but my heart did a little dance to find out she was also adopted. I still can't wrap my head around not wanting your child back, though. My gosh. Yeah, she's all like, how can you love someone who isn't blood? Meanwhile, she's rejecting her own blood son anyway. Story 4. My uncle molested my mom. I don't understand how he's still welcome in the family. Familial abuse is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. This is ours too. My step-uncle molested my mom and all of my mom's siblings. Then his son did the same thing to me because nobody ever had the balls to cut my uncle out of the family. So the generational trauma continues. I was very close with my grandma growing up, and of course never knew about any of this until I was much older. But it turns out she knew what was going on, with her stepson and her other kids, as well as with my cousin and me, and she ignored it because it was easier that way. She's quite old now and has memory issues, so there's no point bringing it up now, but it's made it very hard for me to look back fondly on our relationship. He's a good man who made some bad choices, and nobody's perfect, and God forgives those who pray. My family. My mother always asks me if I'm sure that happened about her ex-husband, and coincidentally my father, even when there was literally photographic evidence used in court. She really believes she'll gaslight me into thinking I imagined all of it one day, because she knew and didn't give a care because he was making a lot of money at work, working out with selling pics of my siblings and I being assaulted. She was trying to gaslight herself into believing it was okay what she did. It wasn't. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Story 5. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt passed away and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. Wait, if you don't mind me asking, What do you mean I never laid eyes on her? What happened there? I was never able to find out. All I knew at the time was that I was sent to live with friends of the family for a while. Eventually, my parents came to get me, and I was raised as an only child. Story 6. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. For years, my older sister's bio-dad died in an accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident. It was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30-some years, and my sister deals with a frickload of mental issues and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday, and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think modern Norman Rockwell style, all-out meals with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who's been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a poopy teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stands up, veins bulging from his head, and absolutely screams, "Yeah, your freaking child molester dad blew his freaking head off. He never had to deal with your BS." And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. That story sure was a wild ride. I hope your sister got some help. And her kids. Story 7. Number 1. My grandfather ended the life of his own son by throwing him on the floor because he was crying. He was just a couple months old. Number 2. My uncle tried to rob a bank and ran away on foot. He later on got married, and his wife ended up committing seppuku. At the time, the police thought that my uncle had ended her life since he had a criminal past. But he didn't. He was at work, and there were witnesses. Number 3. I have multiple half-siblings. My dad was, and is, unfaithful. Number 4. My grandfather burnt the house down with his wife and children inside with the intention of them not making it. My grandmother ran away with her 7 or 8 children, I don't recall, and she asked a priest that she worked for, I think she cleaned his house, to give her a space to stay. He ended up giving her a home that an old lady left for the church, and if I'm not mistaken, she was paying it little by little. Number 5. My aunt's neighbor, who I went to the beach with when I was little, apparently ended the life of his own wife abroad. Number 6. There was a rumor that my uncle's kids weren't his. This may not be the darkest response in this thread, but it is certainly dense. Holy crap. Story 8. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home and, surprise, took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later, my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to end his life on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed that my dad had the life he always wanted, so he tried to end his life. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home after he left the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day Uncle tried to end his life. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. Good on your parents. Is your uncle still around? I guess we'll never know. Story 9. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't until after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he passed, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. For all the people saying my Gramps was a great man, thank you for the kind thoughts, but seeing something you think is cool on the internet is not the reality. He wasn't a good husband, and he wasn't a great father to 3 of his daughters, although he loved my mama very much, as well as me and my brothers and cousins. Being a violent person for good reasons does not make you a good person. It just makes you a means to an end. That's Mike Ehrmantraut. Story 10. My dad's first cousin is serial killer Kenneth McDuff. We saw the America's Most Wanted episode when it aired, and were so surprised to hear about McDuff, not knowing he was a relative. Kenneth Allen McDuff, March 21st, 1946 to November 17th, 1998, was an American serial killer. He was convicted in 1966 of murdering 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, her boyfriend, 17-year-old Robert Brand, and Brand's cousin, 15-year-old Mark Dunham, who was visiting from California. They were all strangers whom McDuff abducted after noticing Sullivan. McDuff repeatedly violated her before breaking her neck with a broomstick. McDuff was given 3 death sentences that were reduced to life imprisonment consequently to the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court ruling Furman v. Georgia. He was paroled in 1989 and went on to kill again. He was executed in 1998 and is suspected to have been responsible for many other killings. Jesus H. Christ, they freaking paroled him after he had been given 3 death sentences, commuted to a life sentence? Story 11. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom passed away. And the person who told me had receipts, solid enough that I had no reason to doubt them. It also explains why my mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for World War II that resulted in a child he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked at her, the cousin, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of the family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. Story 12. I don't know about dark, but here goes. My great-grandfather murdered the mayor of the village he lived in. Why? Because the mayor was sleeping with his mom while his father worked on the field. I think he was 15 or 16 when he did that. Y'all are wild here. When I said I don't know how dark, I meant compared to being related to serial killers, drugs, people who violate others, and incest, like some of the comments here. That's first. Second, what happened to the mom? Obviously, my great-grandfather was not this heartless, so he never told his father. He told my mom, that's my mom's grandfather, sorry I didn't specify, that he confessed to his mom on her deathbed what he did. Yeah, I don't know about dark, proceeds to tell a story about infidelity and murder. Story 13. Y'all's stories are wild. Mine is super tame. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist. Poor Aunt Gloria just wants to be a nudie lady, and everyone acts like she's a leper. I aspire to be Gloria." Story 14. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant, and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned, where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, my paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest, and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Story 15. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer. She lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. I remember my mother lying on the couch in pain when I was a kid. My dad apparently wouldn't pay for her teeth repair, and she had them all pulled at age 35. Wore dentures until she passed at 96. That was cruel. I'm religious about my teeth getting fixed now. Story 16. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave up 2 for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining, one of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Story 17. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. Shame, too. You might have been able to launch one of the most successful podcasts of all time if you had. Porn my dad wrote. Jesus freaking Christ, the opening writes itself. Story 19. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter because she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.